Yes, guys, welcome back to the Cannon podcast. Thank you so much for being here. We're very excited today because we have a new series. We have a debutante on the podcast, and we have something to debut for you in terms of basically how do we get George's Twitter arguments into a format? That was the question. It's his full-time job, arguing with people on Twitter. So we've got to find a way of monetizing it somehow. Here we are. So this is Change My Mind. This is the very first Change My Mind. We're going to do hopefully loads more of these, all that sort of stuff. We'll probably rotate between me, George, and Bhavs. Today, I'm going to be the moderator. I'll explain what that means in just a second. But before I do that, we have George. Hello, George.
Hello.
The lovely comments about your haircut.
Yeah, that's the new way to get subs, I think.
Yes, exactly. And more importantly, we have Tom Canton from
Gunnertalk.
Gunnertalk. Sorry, I'm complete mind blank there. Tom Canton from Gunnertalk. How you doing?
Yeah, good, mate. Yeah, not bad. I was great until you forgot where I'm from.
I'm so sorry. Because I was going to say Football London, but then I realised...
it is that as well, yeah. So that would have been safe as well. So yeah, you're caught between two.
That would have been fun. There you go. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate it. Yes, I'm going to be the moderator. So I'm actually, luckily for you, audience, this is probably the most you're going to hear me talk. I'm basically going to be sort of hopefully focusing the conversation. We were just talking before we started about oftentimes when we've sort of one person's on one side and one person's on the other. Obviously, this has been something through Twitter, so you don't quite know where you agree and where you disagree. I think a lot of the time it's semantics. It's just like, okay, well, one person's saying this, one person's saying that. They're saying basically the same thing, and it might be in sort of different phrases. But actually, I'm going to try and find where you guys actually disagree. And hopefully by the end of the podcast, we'll have a sense of, sort of the real clarity on the two positions and see where you agree and disagree. George is going to read out 3 statements. First one sort of overall on the academy, second 2 on the loan system and sort of the purpose of the academy. And Tom will have a chance to come back on it. At some point, I'll jump in and sort of move us on to the second statement. But I think that's all the sort of all the what's the word? Housekeeping. All the housekeeping done. So let's get started. George is going to read out our first statement to Tom, and Tom will have a chance to respond.
Okay, so the first statement is Mikel Arteta doesn't provide enough opportunities to academy players. Nice and broad, and no way that we can disagree. But,
yeah, it is like a really subjective kind of turn, isn't it? Because it depends on what somebody's view of, enough would be. For somebody, it would be if he gives a debut a season, that's enough. For some, it's we need to be on par with, the likes of Liverpool, Manchester City. For other people, we need to be ahead of those teams. So it's completely down to, personal opinion. From my perspective, I think you have to look at it in the context of what Arsenal have done over the last 4 to 5 years under Arteta and what the ambition has been, and then how can you kind of inject youth into that process. I think if you look at Manchester City, for example, and Liverpool to a lesser degree, these are the 2 teams that have been competing at the top of the Premier League table for the past, besides maybe one off season for Liverpool, the past 5 to 6 seasons. So when you're looking at it in from that perspective, they're established, they're there, they've got the quality, they've got the depth to be able to do that season upon season. Arsenal have been improving and growing and been, Arteta's been built with this aim to get us into this bracket ever since he took over, and that's been the aim, and now he's reached it. And this season I felt like was the season we established ourselves the first time as title challengers. Obviously the season before was the surprise entrance into a title challenge for Arsenal, and it's only really been for me at this point where I think that I will start to really scrutinise from this point forwards how we start to use youth a lot more. From up to this point, I feel like there is a lot of leeway in regards to how much time we've been giving to youth players. And whilst at the same time giving those 7 debuts, I think it's 7, that Arteta has given during his tenure at the club. And obviously there is also something which me and Alex have talked about in the past about kind of the level of quality that has been coming through the academy and how that links into what's available to Arteta as well.
Yeah, and I think that ultimately speaking, I think you have to define kind of your line of opportunity, right? Because I think for most people, I think even just seeing an academy youngster isn't enough. Like I would argue, it wasn't just the fact that there's debuts that happened. If you only had, let's say, a 10-minute debut of once a season, I don't think that's roughly opportunity, for example. I think you need to have maybe a consistent portfolio The only part maybe of disagreement here is kind of when you look at Pep and Klopp, I think they're actually the best way to compare against Mikel because they're both teams that have competed at the top level. And so I think some people might argue as you're coming up, there might be more of a chance to give an opportunity for youth because ironically, you may have a poor quality team and it might be more difficult to have an opportunity to compete with maybe a title challenging squad. Maybe the level of the demand is a little bit higher. But I think the one thing that I struggle with is even in their time together, I think Pep, over his time of being at Manchester City, has had a youth debut rate of 1 every 52 days. And I think Klopp has had one every 56 days, whereas Mikel Arteta has had 1 in 150, which I think has...
George, sorry to jump in. I think I might have given you a bum steer. The Klopp one is definitely true. The Pep one might not be true, but either way, it's lower than Arteta by a significant way.
I think I actually think Pep was 113, to be honest. I think Klopp has done actually a better job of it generally. But when you look at those two teams, you're almost doubling or tripling the rate at debuts. So within the spectrum of opportunity, I think there isn't a number. I wouldn't say, oh, you need a certain debut rate. That's suddenly success. But I think it does give at least a good barometer to say that the two most successful teams at the top have maybe a rate of at least having several debuts that are double, triple the amount that Mikel has done. So on the range of a problem, I'd still probably say it's not as much as maybe Twitter would have you think that there is a complete problem, but I do think it's a point of improvement. And I know that there's specific opportunities that I looked at in the past where I thought, of course, the PSV game, Lons after 5-0, and maybe the last game of not this past season, but the season before. And I would even argue if you're not fighting for something on the last day, I think this season it was not fair because technically we were still fighting. But so you couldn't demand a youth opportunity. But there's certain points I feel that Mikel has had an opportunity but tended towards seniority. And whilst we're getting to a point of challenging, like you, I probably agree I can make a pass for it, but it starts to become a little bit less. And as we kind of leak into maybe the reason why certain youth have been leaving, I think everybody has a spin, so it's really tough to gauge how true it is. But there's certainly been an exodus recently of really top talent that, even if you don't believe doesn't translate to the first team, has left for development in other areas. So you're trying to say, okay, you may lose 1 or 2, but when you have a consistent number of people leaving, that's when you start to maybe say, okay, is there a problem? Do we need a restructure? And maybe we'll talk about that a little bit later, because I do think that Arsenal have agreed largely with a restructuring, not just maybe on recruitment, but even talent in terms of us looking at Phil Cohen, how we've recruited him, how hopefully he's going to change the development centers in kind of different areas. And maybe we can kind of try to talk about what Arsenal are doing from a development standpoint that promotes opportunity.
Who would you point to out of interest? Like, what are the names that come to mind that you think that we could have done?
I think Lino Sousa was definitely somebody that the club felt confident in. I don't know how confident it was from an integration standpoint, but I know at least how he left was through another loan. And I felt like there's an opportunity there for us not to necessarily have him in the first team, but to at least loan him, at least create a pathway for us to take maybe the value of that. But then we start getting into the other parts of the debate, so I don't want to go too far into that. I think in terms of opportunity, when you're looking at maybe Ruel Walters, who's been a part of the first team for so long, you're looking at a Mario Cozier-Dewberry, who is now left. We've confirmed 14 goals, I think, in 17 starts the year before, not given a loan system. And I think we have a rule that maybe we can debate. I don't agree with the Arsenal rule, but I know the rule has been if you're not going to commit to a contract in your last year, they're not going to prioritize sending you out on loan. But the tough part is our decisions on that have been a little bit mixed. So I don't think it's everybody that deserves it, but certainly players that at least the club have felt like they've wanted to prop up in the past. I think Lino Sousa was ironically one of the first players that Arsenal really began this change about trying to recruit domestically. At least he came from West Brom, and the idea was he was really highly thought of, that we would develop into a left back that we could see for the future. And I think it's less about individual cases not working out, because then you get caught in the weeds, because it could be a mentality, a physicality, a technical issue. But I think it's when you start seeing at least consistent people leaving. Arthur Okonkwo, Karl Hein, we've managed to retain at least. But it starts kind of feeling as though that these players are choosing development elsewhere. And that's where I'm starting to have some questions, not from a Mikel standpoint, but maybe from an academy standpoint. Why is that the case?
Yeah, I think that it's fair to ask the question. I think Lino Sousa is a really interesting example, obviously playing in a left-back position, which, if you look at kind of the Arsenal first 11, the left-back position, ironically, has been one where you think maybe there's the most option for change in that one. But the problem is there's such a density of options there with, Zinchenko, Kivi, or Tomiyasu, Yuri and Timber, of course, being signed as well. And Lino Sousa obviously left for Plymouth, got that loan. He only actually started 4 games for Plymouth whilst he was there. Which, if you're looking at a loan for a young player, if we sent a player on loan and they got 4 starts, at that age, and we rate the talent as highly as I can hear you talking about Lino Sousa, I think there'd be an element of frustration that they weren't getting more time and more minutes. And I think that the way in which that, especially at Premier League level, for youngsters, it's tracked very differently in the last 5 to 10 years. We used to see young players get more of an opportunity to go on loan on a number of occasions after reaching the age of 17 where they're able to. We're now seeing in the last 5 to 10 years that these talents have to be getting into the starting 11 of these teams at 17, 18, 19, which obviously barely gives much time for a player that is of the requisite level of talent to actually make that breakthrough into the first team. Because if they're getting a loan, it's going to come when they're 17. And for some players, that might be immediately to a Premier League side. Well, none of the players that we've had come through recently have been of a level that could garner interest from Premier League clubs to take them on loan that would give them enough minutes. The only player recently that went on loan that came through the academy to another Premier League side was Joe Willock, of course, and we made £25 million off that sale, of course, as well. And then you look at, Bukayo Saka, who breaks through at 17, gets minutes. You look at Smith Rowe, 18, 19, when he's making his breakthrough as well. We're not seeing these players, go on loan 2-3 times and before they make that breakthrough into the first team anymore. It was the case where you get that more so, before, I'd say probably around 2015 was really before that point. You were seeing it happen more often, but more recently, the bar is raised, and so that's why Manchester City have Phil Foden as an integrated option in their first 11. They've got some others. Rico Lewis gets a lot of minutes here and there, but he's not an established starter. You've got Oscar Bob, who's on the fringes at the moment of things and getting some minutes. Manchester United, Kobbie Mainoo, who's obviously broken through. But beyond that, you're looking at Garnacho on the left-hand side. You're looking at McTominay's obviously established himself, but I don't think any of us are looking at McTominay and thinking, yes, he's the guy that's going to lead Manchester United to glory in the coming years. And even Garnacho, to an extent, has received a lot of criticism as well from Manchester United supporters, but you'd probably respond in saying he's going to get them a decent fee if he's sold, but they've not been able to match the level that Arsenal have gone to competitively in the Premier League. So I think there's a balance and a trade-off in terms of integration for a team that wants that ambition of getting to, the top level and competing with Liverpool and Manchester City, which for Arsenal sadly has been in part their opportunity given to youngsters. But as I said at the start of kind of our discussion on this, I think that the real scrutiny of how Arsenal integrate youth and where it goes will start really from now that we're at a level like Klopp and Pep were. Can we bring that minute ratio that you were talking about earlier down and more in line with those clubs? I'm not concerned now, but in 2 years' time, if it's not dropped, I think then I'd be concerned.
Tom, just to jump in quickly, so to try and get a sense of the scale in your head of the scale of the problem, if I understand your position correctly, you're saying up to now, you're saying that there's lots of kind of reasons why possibly the players haven't been given the opportunity. We're returning to the statement of Mikel Arteta doesn't give enough opportunities to academy players. How big do you see that as an issue? Maybe even give us an out of 10. How big do you see that issue?
3, 4. It doesn't concern me really at all. Because at the end of the day, the priority for me is Arsenal being competitive in the Premier League. The academy exists to produce the gems, and there's also potential for a revenue stream, which in recent times, that is where kind of Arsenal have fallen in comparison to some of the others. And I think that comes back to the previous conversation that me, Alex, you have had of have we been producing good enough talent? Do I think that the minutes that we could have given to a Mario Kojadubri would have been mind-changing enough for him to decide not to take a move away from the club? I'm not so sure. Would Lino Souza, if we'd have given him minutes, have decided not to go to Aston Villa? Which, by the way, obviously he comes from that area as well, so that's a fact you have to take into account with a player like that. Would it have changed for other players? I don't necessarily think it would. Real Waters burst onto the scene somewhat in those pre-season games a couple of years ago, but for those that have watched a lot of youth football will tell you that he's never kind of reached those heights of what the expectations surrounded of him, and was never showing anywhere near level. And also we forget that Arsenal signed two exceptionally talented 18-year-olds in William Saliba and Gabriel Martinelli, who were then integrated into the first team as well, alongside some of the players that were coming through the academy at the time, like Bukayo Saka, for instance, and Emile Smith-Rowe. So I think there's that balance that I go back to that has to be found. But yeah, at this moment in time, I'm really not concerned about it.
Yeah, I think, I'm not, in terms of it being a large problem, I'm more probably at a 5 or a 6.
Burn the academy
personally.
down, that's what we're saying, yeah.
Yeah, well, 100%. No Lewis Dobbins fee, ridiculous.
Topple the Wenger statue. Get rid of it. Yep.
Yeah, so I probably only disagree. The only reason I have it as a slightly bigger problem is probably because some of the academy talent, and it maybe focuses more on value as opposed to maybe a first team minutes. Because I'm probably with you where I don't think that minutes make an academy player stay. I think it's trust in the development that there's a plan is what would make an academy player stay or go. No matter how great you think the quality is. Like, you could either think Ruel Walters is incredible and the next best thing, or you think that he's terrible. But whether or not he decides to stay with a club is whether I think he believes that there's a plan for integration, professional development, and him to grow ultimately. And there's money involved here, because I think that, you can't dissuade that from the conversation. And I'm not sure if maybe some of the listeners know, but the entire reason why people like Cheeto Obi Martin probably are debating whether or not to leave is because Arsenal are bound by law not to offer professional contracts until these players can turn 17. So there is a component where foreign teams can come in to swoop in. There is a bit of a marketplace now. We can maybe discuss whether or not that's even a good thing for youth in general, that 16-year-olds have been able to be platformed in this way by such big financial sums, because teams coming in and the state of play with Lamine Yamal excelling on the world stage, we're talking about very young people, and the exposure to this. I've often felt very uncomfortable talking about 16-year-olds to this level. But maybe to bring it back to that one statement about opportunity, the one thing that I would probably push back on is opportunity could maybe be seen through successful loans, which I think we have to see because we've brought in a new loan manager from the academy. So Arsenal have clearly seen it as a problem in the same way that they've seen recruitment of talents as a problem. And they've changed their kind of philosophy with Braden Clark, with us looking at other kind of youth talents right now, trying to ensure that we're getting the top talent involved. So we've clearly seen a shift, both recruitment and in the structure of it. And maybe that leads us into the next point, because loans could be a point of improvement for me in the academy.
I was about to say, why don't we move forward to that second point? Because I think this is sort of where the conversation's headed anyway, which is definitely planned.
Yes. And so I think this is probably the one I feel most passionately on. And it's Arsenal's use of the loan system for young players isn't good enough. And I'll give you the floor, Tom, to maybe have your opinion on that.
Yeah,